This is our last message in John chapter 8. It's been a while, hasn't it? It's been an enjoyable message to preach, and I hope that it's been helpful to you. You can also put a bookmark in the book of Exodus somewhere. John chapter 8, verse 51 through 59. Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." The Jews said to him, "Now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets. Yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died, and the prophets died? Who do you make yourself out to be?" Jesus answered, "If I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say, he is our God. But you have not known him. I know him. If I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Before Abraham was, I am. These are the words that Jesus spoke immediately before his enemies picked up stones in an attempt to execute him. And these words, if you remember last week, come after an exchange in which he exposed those Jews who claimed to believe in him, not as children of Abraham as they claimed, and not as children of God as they claimed, but he exposed them as children of Satan. They claimed that they were children of Abraham and therefore children of the covenant. They claimed that they had great spiritual privilege, but Jesus corrects them. Although they were physical descendants of Abraham, they were nothing like Abraham. And remember, we talked about the different ways that you can speak of someone being the son of someone. Not just genetics, not just ethnicity, but how about your character? How about your beliefs? How about your behavior? They did not share the faith of Abraham. They did not share the obedience of Abraham. True children of Abraham are anyone who believes like Abraham believed, who has faith like Abraham had faith, who obeyed God the way that Abraham obeyed God. And so we learned last week that anyone can be a child of Abraham if they have the faith and obedience of Abraham. And so, remember, Jesus exposes these Jews as children of Satan. They're just like their father. They love lies and they have murderous intent. And with that, Jesus brings this whole conflict in John 8 into perspective. Because what we realize is it's not just Jesus against the Jewish leadership. It's not just Jesus against the Pharisees. But what we understand is that this is Christ against Satan. It was Satan behind that unbelief. The Jews were just simply Satan's willing tools. It was only after Jesus couched this conflict in those terms that he says, before Abraham was, I am. The fact that these words are significant is obvious by the passage, by the context. How do we know? Because whatever Jesus meant by that phrase, the Jews received it as worthy of death. So this morning, the question for us is, how can we understand that phrase? When Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, how can we understand this? Well, we need not only to go back to the time of Jesus to understand this, but we actually need to go back about 1,500 more years to the book of Exodus. Even before that, let's go to the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 12. This is where we meet Abraham, here named Abram. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you'll be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And so this is Abraham. This is Abraham with whom the Lord would make covenant. God would make Abraham a great nation. That's part of the covenant. He would make a great nation out of Abraham's descendants. He would bless him. He would make Abraham's name great. And through Abraham, in some way, God would bless the entire world. That's the Abrahamic covenant. But that's oftentimes what we learn with God's promises, that would not come to fruition without trouble. And so we read in Genesis 15, God says to Abraham, "Know for certain that your offspring," now remember, these are the offspring with whom he made covenant, your descendants, I will make them a great nation. But he says, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. It will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. That tells you something about God's promises, right? We're very impatient. But here's a covenantal promise. And he says, "But first, your descendants will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions." What's he talking about here? He's talking about Egypt. He's talking about the Exodus. "As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." And so here the Lord foretells of the Egyptian bondage. God's covenant with Abraham then would be confirmed to his son Isaac, and then to his son Jacob, and then to Jacob's 12 sons, who would eventually settle in Egypt. And at this point, we can say, if you don't know a whole lot about the Bible, Jacob's name would be changed to Israel, so that the children of Israel end up in Egypt, and eventually they'll become the nation of Israel, just to avoid any confusion if you're not aware of that. And so Abraham's descendants would find themselves in Egypt, and there they would remain for 400 years. Generation after generation of descendants of Abraham would live lives immersed in Egyptian culture. Now, remember, if you know the story, they were settled in the northeast portion of Egypt in a land called Goshen. But even then, they would have been exposed to the full breadth of Egyptian influence. You can imagine the children of Israel, the children of Jacob, the descendants of Abraham, there in Egypt would have learned the Egyptian language. 400 years, they would have learned the language, especially when dealing with trade and so on. They would have used it in their daily interactions. The children of Abraham would be exposed to Egyptian arts, to Egyptian architecture, to Egyptian writing. And all of this would have influenced their own. The Jews would have learned Egyptian agricultural techniques. They would have gleaned from Egyptian technologies. They would have acquired a variety of skills that had been honed by the Egyptians. They would become accustomed to the Egyptian diet. We learned that later, remember? After the Exodus, and they start complaining, saying, "Oh, we remember the melons, we remember the leeks, we remember the onions, we remember the garlic, we remember the fish." And they start complaining because they had become so accustomed to that Egyptian diet, which was fed by the nutrient-rich soil along the Nile River. Although many of these things would be used by God to enrich the culture of his people before he called them out as a nation, there was another aspect of that Egyptian influence that God would have to divest his people of before they could become a nation. That is Egyptian religion. Egyptian religion. You can imagine what the average Jew would have witnessed as they spent 400 years in Egypt, living in the vibrant agricultural community of Goshen in northeast Egypt. They would have been constantly surrounded by expressions of the Egyptian polytheism, the worship of multiple gods. Each morning, the Jews might see their Egyptian neighbors offering prayers and sacrifices to the Nile god Hapi, seeking his blessing for abundant waters and fertile lands. As they navigated the marketplace, the Jews would have regularly encountered symbols of the god Hathor, the goddess of love and protection, often depicted as a person with the head of a cow. Similarly, they would be exposed to the reverence of Heket, the frog-headed goddess, the goddess of fertility, another daily reminder that the Egyptians were committed to polytheism. Then there was the omnipresent figure of Ra, the sun god, whose images would have dominated the landscape, temples, obelisks dedicated to Ra. It was a focal point of Egyptian culture. They would make sacrifices to Ra in order to secure or to ensure that the sun would complete its cycle day after day after day. Another god, Geb, the god of the earth, was believed to be responsible for the fertility of the land. And so the Jews would have seen their Egyptian counterparts sacrificing day after day to Geb, hoping for bountiful harvest and protection from natural disasters. Perhaps most striking of all would have been the Egyptian worship of the god Osiris, the god of the afterlife. The elaborate mummification process, the grand tombs, the rituals to secure a place in the afterlife would have been all around the Jews. Thus, the Israelites in Egypt were constantly exposed to those influential gods whose worship shaped every facet of Egyptian life. So while in Egypt, the Jews did manage to maintain some distinction between them and the Egyptians. That's partly because they're primarily shepherds. Remember when they come into Egypt and Joseph secures the land of Goshen for them? Because they're shepherds. And he says the Egyptians look at shepherds as an abomination. And so there's somewhat of a natural division between the Jews and the Egyptians being primarily urban traders and agriculturalists, and the Jews being those who dealt with livestock. Yet, nevertheless, even with that distinction, there was an assimilation that took place when it came to Jewish Egyptian religion. The division between Jew and Egyptian also fostered resentment and animosity, prejudice, and ultimately oppression. We know this because Exodus 1 verse 9 says that after a king arose who did not know Joseph, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. They made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. I remember that hundreds of years earlier, God had made a covenant with Abraham, one in which he promised to bless him and provide for him a land, and to provide a land for his descendants, and through him bless the entire world. Where are these promises now? Those promises looked impossible to be fulfilled at this time in Israel's history. Well, now they're oppressed by the Egyptians. They were enslaved, they possessed no land, and they were despised by the people, not a blessing to the people. And so you might not blame Israel at this time, as they're under Egyptian oppression, to maybe doubt the reality of God's promises. But then we read this in Exodus 2, verse 23. "During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew." God was sympathetic to their suffering. God was merciful in the midst of their oppression. He heard, and he's going to answer in faithfulness to his covenant promises. The time had come for God to bring his people out of Egypt. In his providence, he had used the Israelites sojourning in Egypt for hundreds of years to really prepare his people for this moment so that they could come out and be a nation. They went into Egypt as only 70 people. Now they're coming out with 600,000 men plus women and children. God used Egypt in their time there as almost an incubator to produce his people as a nation, ready to be drawn out at this time. They went in as nomadic shepherds. They would come out as a people heavily influenced by the most stable, the most educated, and the most technologically advanced nation on earth. And so God used this time to prepare them to come out, to be their own nation under his theocratic rule. However, as much as God used the Egyptian influence to develop his people as a nation, as we've already touched upon, there were aspects of this influence which he would have to purge from Israel. Namely, he would have to purge them of the influences of Egyptian religion. For this reason, he wouldn't simply just bring his people out. Instead, what? He's going to bring about a dramatic course of events designed to remind the Jews who he was. Specifically, he is going to teach his people who he is in contrast to the gods of Egypt. This explains why God chose to carry out the events of the Exodus in the way that he did. God intended the Exodus to be a seminal event which would forever establish his relationship to the children of Israel. This is why the Exodus is continually invoked by biblical authors, both implicitly and explicitly. Exodus-like themes permeate and pervade Scripture from the Exodus all the way to the book of Revelation. It ultimately provides a framework through which we even understand the redemptive work of Jesus. So what was the Lord's motivation for the Exodus? We're told in Exodus chapter 2, verse 24, that the Lord was moved to action upon hearing the groaning of his people. It was then that it says God remembered his covenant. Remembered his covenant. It was his covenant faithfulness which led him to stretch out his mighty arm over Egypt and to redeem his people. But why did God choose to deliver his people with such grandeur? And I'm assuming you know the story. Why did God choose to deliver his people from Egypt with a prolonged clash against Pharaoh? Why the successive miracles, the plagues? Why that way? Why the inauguration of the Passover? Why the dramatic judgment of Pharaoh and the army? Why the parting of the Red Sea? Why all of this? Because the Lord's intention through the Exodus was not simply to rescue his people from slavery, but to claim them as his treasured possession. They would be his people and he would be their God. But this could not take place. Until they became reacquainted with the God of their fathers. For 20 or so generations, the descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob lived among Egyptian culture and religion. For many of them, the God of their fathers was but a dim memory, while the gods of Egypt were an ever-present daily reality. For this reason, the Lord would use the events of the Exodus to reintroduce himself to his people. So now look at Exodus 3. This is where we find God preparing Moses to lead his people out of Egypt. If you're a visitor this morning, yes, I usually do speak this fast, but we have a lot to get through this morning as well. Exodus 3, verse 1 through 22. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of Yahweh appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When Yahweh saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then Yahweh said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, and you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? Interesting. Moses expected that if he went into Egypt and spoke to the Jews and said, The God of your fathers has sent me, he expects that the question would be, What's his name? Who is he? That's an odd question. This reveals something to us about the degree to which the Jews were exposed and affected by the polytheism of Egypt. We would think that the mention of the God of their fathers, they would say, Oh, yes, our God. But that's not the response. Well, what's his name? They were supposed to be monotheists. They were supposed to be the conviction that there was only one true God. You'd think his name would be easily upon their lips. Yet God to them seems at this moment simply to be one named God among a host of other named gods. The fact is, he was the one true, transcendent, and all-powerful God. The God who revealed himself to and made covenant with their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what do we find? If God would make a holy nation out of these people, a nation entirely consecrated to him as the one true, transcendent God, he's going to have to reintroduce himself to his people. He's going to have to divest them of any sympathies they might have to Egyptian polytheism. This is what he begins to do in his answer to Moses. So look in verse 13 of Exodus 3. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. So God says to Moses, I am who I am. This is simultaneously an incredible answer and an incredible non-answer. We name things to distinguish them one from another, right? We got some twins in the church. I'm trying to learn the difference between the twins. And sometimes the only way I can tell is just because of the name. You name things differently to distinguish them one from another. What God is communicating here is that I am the transcendent God who defies category. I'm not a being. I am the source of all being. By saying I am who I am, he's saying I am eternal, I am self-existent, I am unchanging, I am the transcendent God. I have no equal and I have no rival. He continues, verse 15. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel. Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. He's saying, I'm the same God who appeared to your fathers. He's saying, if the children of Israel have adopted any notion that the God who appeared to their fathers was analogous in any way to any of the gods of Egypt, then they should stand corrected. Saying there's one God, he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it is this transcendent God who's now appearing to you. He then says to Moses, this is my name forever, and thus I'm to be remembered throughout all generations. If they ask you what my name is, tell them I am. Tell them Yahweh. Let them know that I am the supreme, transcendent source of all life and being. And then he says, this is how I want to be known. This is God himself telling us, this is my name, this is how I want to be addressed. This is how I want to be known. And he says, throughout all generations. Now, admittedly, that's not really the answer Moses wanted. Nor would it be an answer readily understood by Israel. That's abstract. Tell them I am. Tell them the I am sent you. It's abstract. It needs more explanation. But this is exactly what God is going to give Moses and the children of Israel, and to a certain degree, even the Egyptians, through the events of the Exodus. What's about to happen is intended by God to fill out the meaning of what it means when he says Yahweh, or I am. Just to prove to you that this is the point of the Exodus, Exodus 7, verse 5. The Lord says, the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them. Exodus 8, 7. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. Exodus 7, 17. Thus says Yahweh, by this you, speaking of Pharaoh, shall know that I am Yahweh. Exodus 8, 22. On that day I will set apart the land of Goshen where my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there, that you, Pharaoh, may know that I am Yahweh in the midst of the earth. I am the transcendent God who has become immanent, and here I am in the midst of the earth. Exodus 10. Then Yahweh said to Moses, go into Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may show these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your grandson how I have dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and what signs I have done among them, that you may know that I am Yahweh. Exodus 14, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, and the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh. Exodus 29, verse 46, and they, Israel, shall know that I am Yahweh, their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt that I might dwell among them. I am Yahweh, their God. The events of the Exodus were designed by God to be a grand reintroduction of himself to his people, a refresher in his former revelation to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and additional revelation as to who he was. Exodus chapter 6, verse 2 says, God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. What he's saying to Moses and to the children of Israel, you are about to receive revelation that I had not revealed to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And how's he going to do it? He's going to do it through a course of events. And so everything that we witness in the Exodus is us learning what it means when God says, I am. We're learning what it means when he speaks his name, Yahweh. Now, consider the gods of Egypt and how the one transcendent God, Yahweh, illustrated his power and their impotence through the plagues. The Egyptians worshipped a god, as we already mentioned, named Hapi. He's the god of the Nile. What is Yahweh's first miracle? Turning the Nile into blood, a humiliating defeat of Hapi. The Egyptians worshipped Heket, who is depicted as a frog-headed woman. Yahweh's second plague was what? A plague of frogs, illustrating that those frogs answered to Yahweh and Yahweh alone, and Heket was powerless to stop him. As already mentioned, the Egyptians worshipped a god named Geb, the god of the earth. Yahweh's third plague brought gnats and lice from the dust of the earth, demonstrating that Geb had no control over the very ground from which those pests arose. The Egyptians worshipped a god named Khepri, the god associated with creation and rebirth, often depicted as a scarab beetle. Yahweh's fourth plague unleashed swarms of flies, showing that Khepri had no dominion over those swarms that brought chaos and discomfort. The death of the livestock struck right to the heart of the worship of the god Hathor, that cow-headed goddess, demonstrating her inability to protect the animals which the Egyptians associated with her. The Egyptians venerated Isis, the goddess of medicine and peace. Yahweh's sixth plague inflicted painful boils on the Egyptians, revealing that Isis was impotent in providing protection and peace over the people who worshipped her. The Egyptians believed in the power of the god Nut, the sky goddess, and Set, the god of storms and disorder. Yahweh's seventh plague sent devastating hail from the sky, showing Nut's inability to control the heavens and prevent destruction, and Set's powerlessness over the storms. The Egyptians worshipped a god named Renenutet, the goddess of nourishment and harvest. Yahweh's eighth plague brought locusts to consume all the remaining crops, proving that Renenutet had no protective power over the harvest. The Egyptian god Ra was the sun god. When Yahweh brought deep darkness over the land, it was a direct affront to Ra. It demonstrated that Yahweh, not Ra, controlled darkness and light. And the final plague of death on the firstborn struck right to the heart of Egypt's belief in the afterlife. The final and most devastating plague showed that Osiris, the god of the afterlife, had no power to save or protect Egypt's future generations. The life and the afterlife of every living being was not in the hands of Osiris, but was in the hands of Yahweh. Now, question. We could go on and name more Egyptian gods. Are those gods real? Yes and no. They're real in the sense that men created them and ascribed power to them and offered worship to them. But they're real in another sense as well. Moses would later characterize the rebellion of Israel in this way in Deuteronomy 32:17. It says, they sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. Certainly influenced in remembering the influence of Egyptian polytheism, Israel at times rebelled and fell back into it. And Moses says, you know what they're worshiping? Not a statue, Not a painting, not some representation. He's saying they were worshiping demons. Psalm 106:36 says, they served their idols, which became a snare to them. They sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons. Speaking of the worship of Molech, in which the worship of which entailed giving your babies, burning them in the statues of Molech. And the psalmist says they were worshiping demons. And then even in the New Testament, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:19, what do I imply then? The food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. In one sense, the idol's nothing. He says, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. And so in one sense, no, the God is nothing. It's something that you made. You just carved out something, and it's just your creation. It is really nothing. But on the other hand, there's a sense in which idol worship is demon worship. Satan is capable of producing what appear to be miracles. Satan is capable of seducing and deceiving and capturing souls. Satan is more than happy to encourage idol worship and then to embody the fake gods that are worshipped. So in this sense, we can understand the Exodus as God exercising his power over the satanic realm. We can understand this as God storming the spiritual citadel erected by Satan in the form of Egyptian polytheism and vanquishing it. We can understand the Exodus as Yahweh binding Satan and spoiling his house. Is God releasing his people from the grip of the devil? He leaves Satan powerless in the face of his unmatched might. Now, besides those judgments on the Egyptian gods, or better, Satan, the Lord also demonstrates through the Exodus his sovereignty over the hearts of men. Remember, he meets Pharaoh's hard heart by hardening it further. Remember, he uses Pharaoh's rebellious heart to bring himself glory, so that by the end of the Exodus event, there's no question that God was the Almighty, that there's no rival God, let alone any rival earthly king. All of this, again, was intended to teach the Jews and the Egyptians in glorious fashion that there is only one God and that his name is Yahweh. It wasn't just Yahweh's sovereign power and transcendence, however, that was on display. Now remember what we're doing here. We're filling out the definition of what Yahweh means. This is meant to be brought to the remembrance of the Jews every time they spoke the name of their God. But far more is revealed through the Exodus, beyond his power. Through the Exodus, we learn that Yahweh is the sole creator. We learn that Yahweh can suspend the laws of creation and produce miracles. We understand that Yahweh is the only sovereign over creation and over the hearts of men. We learn that Yahweh is a covenant-making and covenant-keeping God. We learn that Yahweh always fulfills his promises. We learn that Yahweh redeems his people. We learn that Yahweh is merciful to the suffering of his people. We learn that Yahweh is a personal God who invites his people into relationship with him. We learn that Yahweh makes a distinction between his people and all other peoples. We learn that Yahweh is provider, protector, and guide. We learn that Yahweh is a warrior who fights for his people. And again, all of this was designed by God to help Israel fill in the gaps in their understanding of what it means when it is spoken that he is the great I am. All of this was meant to lend definition and meaning to the name Yahweh. And so from this point on, when they spoke his name, they would know that they were speaking of the one true, all-powerful, all-knowing, always present, unchanging, covenant-keeping Redeemer who was the relational God who loves, provides for, protects, and guides his people. Through the Exodus, Yahweh became imbued with precious, awe-inspiring meaning. Now, we know that the Exodus had its intended effect because we have Exodus 15. Now, remember, Moses speaks to the Lord in the burning bush. What's your name? And he says, if I go to Egypt and speak to Israel, I'm going to have to answer that question from them because they don't know you to the degree they ought to know you. That's where we started. Then the Exodus happened. God hears their cries, remembers his covenant, redeems them, vanquishes their enemies, and so on. Then we come to Exodus 15. You know what Exodus 15 is? It's a song. This is Moses and Israel after all of these events erupting into song, and here we learn what they learned about Yahweh. It begins in Exodus 15. Then Moses and the people of Israel sang this song to Yahweh, saying, I will sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. Now listen to the personal nature of this. Yahweh is my God. Yahweh is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. Not Heket, not Osiris, not Isis, none of these. Yahweh is my God. Continues, verse 3. Yahweh is a man of war. Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his host he cast into the sea, and his chosen officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Yahweh, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Yahweh, shatters the enemy. Should we stop here and acknowledge that our translation up here says Lord in all caps and not Yahweh? Has that been confusing to any of you? Is anything that we've said thus far maybe indicate to you that God wants to be known by the name Yahweh? I think he explicitly said, this is my name by which I'll be known throughout all generations. And our Bible translation has chosen, with really no basis in the Hebrew, to take the name Yahweh and replace it with Lord in all caps. I'll let you stew on that one. Continues, Exodus 15, verse 7. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrow your adversaries. You send out your fury. It consumes them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword. My hand shall destroy them. You blew with your wind. The sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. And then with a wonderful declaration, sung by the people who had been surrounded by polytheism, surrounded by that worship for centuries. Verse 11 says, who is like you, O Yahweh, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? And of course, that's rhetorical. The intended statement is what? There are no gods like you, Yahweh. There are no gods who are majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, and doing wonders like you. Israel learned the lesson intended by God through the events of the Exodus. Learn what it means that I am. Learn what it means when I say I am Yahweh. Continues, you stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. You have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. The peoples have heard, they trembled. Pangs have seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Now are the chiefs of Edom dismayed. Trembling seizes the leaders of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fell upon them because of the greatness of your arm. They are still as a stone till your people, O Yahweh, pass by, till the people pass by whom you have purchased. And with that, they recognize that Yahweh is Redeemer. They recognize that Yahweh is a God of steadfast covenant love. They recognize that they have been purchased by him. They recognize that they belong to him. Verse 17, you will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Yahweh, which you have made for your abode, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. Yahweh will reign forever and ever. For when the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and his horsemen went into the sea, Yahweh brought back the waters of the sea upon them, but the people of Israel walked on dry ground in the midst of the sea. Then Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines dancing, and Miriam sang to them, sing to Yahweh. Moses has taught the song, let's sing it. Sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. And so through the Exodus, God reintroduces himself to his people. He is Yahweh the I Am. There are none who compare. There is no power which challenges. There are no gods which can compete. There is no demonic or satanic power that can stand. He is the one and only ground of all being, the self-existent, transcendent God who is also immanent, ready to make covenant with his people and enter into relationship with him. That this was God's intention is clearly seen in what he says to Moses later on when they start preparing the tabernacle. Exodus 29, verse 43. The Lord says, "There I will meet with the people of Israel, and it shall be sanctified by my glory. And I will consecrate the tent of meeting and the altar. Aaron also and his sons I will consecrate to serve me as priests. I will dwell among the people of Israel and will be their God. And they shall know that I am Yahweh their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am Yahweh their God." And so in the shadow of all the temples in Egypt, Israel is going to build their own tabernacle. But that tabernacle is not going to be any of the gods of the Egyptian pantheon. This temple or tabernacle is going to be to the one true God, Yahweh. So the tabernacle and later the temple stand as testaments that Yahweh was the God of Israel. This was Yahweh, the God of Israel, who dwelt among his people. He was simultaneously the all-powerful creator and the merciful relational redeemer who invited his people to worship him and him alone. The tabernacle and later the temple were the earthly meeting place of man and the I am. Now back to John 8. This is still, remember, if you've been with us for the last couple months, still in the context of the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles. And where did that take place? It took place on the temple grounds. And what did it celebrate? It celebrated the Exodus, celebrated God's deliverance of his people, celebrated God guiding them with the pillar of fire at night and the cloud in the day, celebrated all that. This is where we are. This is Jesus speaking to the Pharisees on the temple grounds. Remember, Jesus speaks to these Jews who viewed themselves as children of Abraham and therefore God's covenant people. And remember, he exposes them as actually being influenced by and children of Satan. And so we have on one side of this conflict what? Vessels of Satan. On the other side, we have Jesus. But the scene is much greater than that. Jesus says to the Jews, "Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad." So the Jews said to him, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" And Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." And the Jews knew exactly what he intended by that statement. How do we know they knew? Because they tried to kill him. They understand that Jesus in this moment is identifying himself with Yahweh. They understand that Jesus is taking upon himself the same title of the God of the Exodus. Jesus saw in them the fingerprints of Satan. And he responds to them accordingly. Remember, they had the intent to murder Jesus. They would eventually succeed in murdering Jesus. But in doing so, could they ever actually really defeat him? No. Why? Because the same God who stormed the citadel of satanic power at the Exodus, exposing Satan as impotent before him, had now come in the flesh and was now standing in front of those Jewish children of Satan. The same God who vanquished Egypt, that bastion of demonic power, the same God who redeemed his people from its oppression, had now stepped into his creation to once again free his people from satanic captivity. But this time, with an unalterable spiritual deliverance, to once and for all bring his people into covenant relationship with himself forever. In other words, Yahweh had come in the flesh in order to personally lead his people in a second Exodus, an exodus out of spiritual oppression and death, and into a promised land of spiritual freedom and life. Jesus, whose name means what? Yahweh saves, was the great I am in the flesh. This is why Paul could describe Jesus this way in Colossians 1. For by him all things were created. In him and on earth, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. This is why the writer of Hebrews could say of Jesus, he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. Jesus is Yahweh in the flesh, embodying all the attributes and characteristics that were revealed to the Israelites through the Exodus. As Yahweh, he is the creator and sustainer of all things, the one who has power over all creation. Just as Yahweh demonstrated his supremacy over the gods of Egypt, Jesus is displaying his authority over Satan. Just as Yahweh proved sovereign over nature and sickness and even death through Jesus' earthly ministry, he calms the storm and he heals the sick and even raises the dead. Just as Yahweh, the covenant-keeping God, is faithful and true to his promises, Jesus, as the fulfillment of God's covenant, came to redeem his people and bring them into a new covenant relationship with God. Just as Yahweh heard the cries of his people in Egypt and delivered them, Jesus hears the cries of those who are oppressed by sin and offers them deliverance through himself. Just as Yahweh revealed himself to be the compassionate and merciful God who provides for and protects and guides his people, so Jesus has come in the flesh as the great shepherd who loves and provides and protects and guides his people. So Yahweh is the self-existent, eternal I am. And Jesus claims this title for himself. He asserts his divinity. He asserts his eternal existence. He's the same God who revealed himself to Moses and led the Israelites out of bondage. In Jesus, the Son of God, Yahweh came to dwell among his people once again. Not in a tabernacle, not in the temple, as was just celebrated during the Feast of Booths, but in human flesh, bringing the presence of God directly into the world. So Jesus, the great I am, is the all-powerful, all-knowing, ever-present Son of God who came to defeat the forces of Satan. He's the one who came to invite us into relationship with the Father through himself. And he calls us to follow him. He calls us to follow him in a second Exodus, wherein we might find freedom from sin, where we might find relationship with the Father, where we might find eternal life in his presence. So this morning, if you're a Christian this morning, a Christian, this is the Jesus that you worship. If you're not a Christian, this is the Jesus who is calling you to follow him so that you can find redemption, so that you can find forgiveness, so that you can enter relationship with the one true God, so that you can have relationship with Yahweh. We're going to end here. But I think, Becky, why don't you come forward? I think just as we saw Israel learn who Yahweh was, and then at the end of that revelation, for them come to a place where they erupt in song to celebrate who he was, I think it's very fitting for us to do the same as Christians, having understood who Jesus is when he claims that he is the I am. So with that, let's stand and let's close with one song.